They had a litany of crimes that they were wanting to commit.
I was a monster.
There's nothing that compares to this, just in terms of the sheer brutality.
They were indulging their fantasy.
I was under the impression that friendship is more important than anything else, even the lives of others.
On January the 5th, 1997, police in Bellevue, Washington State, received an urgent call.
Two young boys on their bicycles drove through this path. They discovered the human body.
When investigators arrived at the scene, they found the body of a woman with a rope tied around her neck.
One assumption was made that the person could have committed suicide by hanging. Then the rope broke and she fell to the ground.
But it soon became evident that she'd been murdered.
The rope had been tied with two knots, securing the rope around her neck. That would indicate that the killer wanted to make sure that she would not survive.
Cigarette ends were found at the scene. The victim's name was also discovered.
After the body was located, it was identified through a checkbook that was found in the back pocket of her jeans. Determined it to be a Kimberly Wilson of an address approximately 4 to 5 blocks from this location.
Radio David 31. I'm proceeding on 121st Avenue Southeast, the Wilson residence, to make a death notification.
When I arrived at the Wilson's residence, I went up to the front door, and there was no answer.
The back door was unlocked.
At this point, my gut tells me that there is something wrong. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a danger to me or to the people that are in the residence, possibly. I called out so that anyone in the house would know that I was there. There was no answer. I walked to the end bedroom. In the doorway, I discovered the body. It was a young girl. She was face down in a pool of blood at the threshold of the bedroom. Her head and torso was bludgeoned and slashed, probably by a knife of some sort.
Please, no.
There's quite a bit of blood spattered throughout the walls and the door where she was lying. I didn't know if that murderous suspect was still in the home and possibly ready to attack me.
No, please, no.
But I had to keep my wits about me and was prepared to take a life if a suspect were there. I could see a woman on the bed. Bludgeoned, her head mutilated, blood spatter all over the wall and the headboard of the bed.
More horror awaited Jeff Gomes.
There was a male lying in a huge pool of blood at the foot of the bed with clothed only in a t-shirt. An unbelievable shoe print mark in blood on the back of the t-shirt and some shoe prints from the puddle of blood on the carpet.
3 people had been slaughtered in their home, and a 4th victim had been murdered in the nearby park.
Police officers very rarely come upon dead bodies. Locating the bodies, for me, was a traumatic incident.
The forensic team began to process the crime scene.
We found a cut-up black T-shirt that had the front section cut out of it.
Severed power leads revealed that electrical items had been stolen.
This might lead one to believe that it was a burglary. And the burglary might have gone bad.
The victims had suffered frenzied attacks.
It was evident from the scene and from the bodies that the objective of these murders was the act of killing itself.
Police found numerous bloody footprints. There was also forensic evidence which could reveal the killer's DNA. The post-mortems confirmed the victims were Bill and Rose Wilson and their 17-year-old daughter, Julia. All three had died from extreme blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds.
I'd describe the killers as severely psychologically disturbed with the extreme amount of rage given the number of people that were killed.
Rose Wilson had been attacked while she slept. She had been repeatedly stabbed, even after she had died.
It was clear that she hadn't been moving at the time, that there was no motive other than the killer's effort to experience plunging that knife into that woman.
Bill Wilson had also been repeatedly clubbed and stabbed.
A piece of the suspect's knife, the tip, was found embedded in his skull.
It seemed very likely that there was more than one person involved in the homicides because there were two distinct weapons used, and used repeatedly. There was clearly some kind of long cutting instrument, some long blade that someone wielded against all the victims and wielded with great enthusiasm. It was equally evident that someone had used what appeared to be a baseball bat.
Julia's body was found lying in her bedroom doorway. Her defensive wounds suggested she had fought for her life.
Julia Wilson was bludgeoned over her head, her throat was slashed, and a number of knife wounds into her chest.
The victim in the park was confirmed as 20-year-old Kim Wilson, the family's eldest daughter. The coroner verified that Kim had been strangled and kicked with force. The Bellevue community was terrified. Two killers were at large. Police feared they could strike again. In January 1997, Bellevue police were investigating the brutal slaying of the Wilson family. The quiet Seattle suburb was terrified.
Quadruple murders are extremely rare, but they're even rarer in this part of the world. So I think the entire community was in shock and frightened. And I think it affected people very deeply.
The Wilson family had been ferociously attacked.
It didn't appear that Bill or Rose Wilson had any enemies or engaged in any kind of high-risk lifestyles that might have made them, subject to the predation of people like this.
The Wilsons were an ordinary and happy family.
The father, Bill, he worked as an accountant for a steel firm locally here. The mother, Rose, worked at the University of Washington.
Their eldest daughter, Kim, was visiting her family.
Kim worked at the AmeriCorps in San Diego. It was a government-subsidized organization for youth. The youngest daughter, Julia, was still in high school.
A massive murder investigation was now underway.
I speak to family members, associates of the family, neighbors, anyone that can give me information that would lead me to a possible suspect.
A friend informed police about a boy Kim had dated years earlier.
She supplied me with information about a young man named David who dropped out of high school.
And you can do this.
Would bum cigarettes off of Kim and meals.
David Anderson had owed Kim money.
She began to keep a tally of the amount of money that he owed her and began to become more assertive about suggesting to him that he needed to pay it back.
Why have you not paid me back yet?
David had previously signed a promissory note.
The friend also told police about David's friend, Alex Barani.
She thought Alex was a bit weird.
Alex kind of had like a Seattle grunge look, you know, greasy hair, kind of darker clothes, not clean shaven, kind of dirty. He was always real quiet, never really said a lot. And when he did, it was either inappropriate or it didn't have much meaning.
He was David's constant companion. And we heard also that Alex Barani and David Anderson were sort of engaged in sword play and sword collection. And our attention focused very quickly on those two.
David Anderson was born on March 2nd, 1979. He grew up in Bellevue, Washington State. His father was a security systems manager, and his mother was a housewife.
There were rumors among the kids that we interviewed that he had a very difficult relationship with his father.
His dad was very much a disciplinarian with him, and David, I think, rebelled against that and acted out.
From an early age, David unleashed his frustrations on others.
A bully is generally related to someone that has a great deal of insecurity. David expressed his anger through devaluing and rejecting other people before they could reject him.
But he also had a friendlier side.
I never noticed David being unusually aggressive or violent. You know, David was kind of a pretty boy. I think I can think of at least 3 or 4 girls that he had been with that I can think back and think, you know, he had more girlfriends than I had.
Anderson was an attractive young man. He had a wide circle of friends. He was apparently admired by a number of his peers.
I think David's personality typology was narcissistic. These people generally are somewhat grandiose and fun to be around and draw other people to them, attract people to them.
In 1991, David met Alex Barani. Alex Barani Jr. was born on May the 14th, 1979, in Ohio. He learnt to read when he was just 3 years old.
He was a very bright kid, a very intelligent, engaging individual.
The family moved to Everett in Washington state. Alex became introverted when his parents divorced.
I really didn't feel very close to either of my parents. At that point in my life, I was kind of distancing myself from a lot of people. I could have really used a brother or sister. Somebody to share the load, you know? Somebody to talk to. Would have been nice. Somebody that was constant.
His life was unsettled as he lived with each parent. He changed schools frequently.
My father started moving us around a lot, so I didn't have a chance to make a lot of new friends and stuff.
You get an impression of a lonely, vulnerable, kind of a disillusioned kid that was bouncing between two parents.
As his isolation increased, so did his anger with the world.
I stopped trying to get friends. Recess at school, I'd walk around by myself, you know, walk in circles around, you know, it's just me by myself. You know, I wasn't trying to reach out to other people.
It led to depression and alienation, and ultimately built a great deal of rage.
I used to hate everyone.
When David and Alex met, they became close friends.
David was my absolute best friend in the world. I loved him like a brother, you know, and I would do anything for him. He was the person that I felt understood me.
There's no question that when the two of them got together, they empowered each other.
Together, they intended to shock the world.
I wanted to do something that was inconceivable to a normal person.
January 1997, Bellevue police were investigating a quadruple homicide. They were interested in the relationship between their key suspects, Alex Barani and David Anderson.
The relationship between Alex and David was a curious one. But the two of them together, there was a certain intimacy. I'm not suggesting it was sexual, but it was the kind of intimacy that you associate with people in a romantic relationship. They were inseparable.
For the first time in his life, Alex Barani didn't feel isolated.
A person that feels so alone and so separated from society, when they find that one person that they really understand and that they believe really understands them, it's solid gold. You can't just give it up.
Yeah. I think Alex saw David as someone who was probably a little bit cooler than he was, someone who was a little bit more popular. So I think he really looked up to David and that kind of role model figure.
In 1995, both Alex and David dropped out of school.
I think high school was a difficult time for both David and Alex of just not fitting in with the mainstream.
They both were 17 years old. They pretty much were just lost juvenile delinquents. They both had no direction in their life, had no good relationships with either of their families.
Although they both found jobs, they became increasingly subversive.
I'd hate to describe myself as a goth kid, but I pretty much was, yeah. I started seeking out more of a kind of a counterculture thing. You know, I got involved with wearing all black in high school. Thought about depressing thoughts a lot. You know, I was very angry most of the time, but I didn't go out looking for fights. Never attacked anyone for no reason.
David and Alex fought out fantasy battles in the park.
You know, I can remember David and Alex playing this game they called Kintaboto, which I guess is like a Dungeons and Dragons.
Take this PVC piping, you know, the plumber's pipe, and put the styrofoam insulation around it, mop it up like a sword.
They eventually replaced their fake swords.
I used to keep samurai swords. I kept them as art, just because they're really beautiful objects.
David Anderson displayed his collection of knives and bats, and Alex did the same. And so it was no secret that they had weapons and that they practiced with them.
I often thought very dark things. I often thought, what would it be like to kill somebody? What would make me cross that line?
The pair talked openly about murder.
David brought up the idea of murder before Alex.
You ever thought about, like, murdering somebody?
I think it was brought up in the gauge of being a fantasy at first.
David would expound on a list that he devised of people he wanted to kill. His friends were sitting around, they would talk about it, they would add names, who they hated, who he hated.
David's former girlfriend, Kim Wilson, was shocked when she discovered her name was on their death list.
She confronted both David and Alex about it. I don't think that she ever realized or understood that her life was in real jeopardy.
A few days after the Wilsons' bodies were discovered, police questioned Alex about his whereabouts on the night of the murders.
He indicated that he was home all that night with David Anderson. They were playing video games.
But his alibi soon fell apart.
Another renter in that home indicated that Alex had left sometime around 11 o'clock with David Anderson. This essentially put a conflict in Alex Brawny's alibi.
They came in and asked me if I would give another interview down at the station. I was kind of worried, but at the same time, I really didn't think that they were going to arrest me. I was definitely egotistical enough to think that way. But then again, I realized that they knew I was lying. At that point, I just felt like, well, if they know, then what's the point of trying to hide it?
He had on all of her dark clothes, black.
He was describing in enormous detail, in the most vivid way, murdering the Wilsons. I didn't expect it. He was in an exhilarated state.
You know, just time. I couldn't stop thinking, like...
He was aroused by what he'd done and what he'd planned so long to do.
When I realized I was strangling her, I remember seeing her face turn blue and I couldn't stop.
He spoke of stabbing the mother in her temple as she lay in the bed.
The more I did it.
At times he was overtly excited about it, saying, you know, the human skull's a hard thing.
Sort of like, the skull
He thought he could stab the person in the head and plunge the knife right through it.
To hear Alex Brawny describe in sort of excruciating detail, it's almost hard to believe that anyone could recount it in such great detail with no real signs of remorse at all.
I think that the way I described this stuff was not because I wanted to shock so much as just be real with it, make people understand.
With who?
And he knew Julia was in her bedroom down the hall.
I definitely was not in the moment. I was almost like a zombie, sleepwalking through it. After killing the girl in the park, I was so absolutely numb that I could have done anything at that point. You know, then there's, you know, somebody on your shoulder saying, well, you have to finish what you started.
She knelt in front of him crying, and he said, I'm sorry, I have to do this. And he killed her there.
I was a monster.
He had no remorse about what he did to that entire family.
During police interviews, I said, you know what, I don't feel guilty. And that wasn't true. I did immediately realize that I'd done something very wrong.
Why did you go to the house?
His candid confession shocked investigators.
He said that he had been feeling, and I quote him, as if he were in a rut. He wanted to experience something transcendent. He wanted to experience something that was extraordinary.
But Alex wouldn't state who was with him that night.
Spent an awfully long time in interrogation, making up lies to protect others. Taking the full blame. Imagine a 17-year-old kid walking into a police interrogation and saying, you know what, I did everything, which is exactly what I said.
He would not confess to David being involved with him in this murder.
I was under the impression that friendship is more important than anything else, even the lives of others.
He said, you know, don't ask me to rat out David, I'd rather get the death penalty.
I believe Alex depended on David, and I think he was protecting David out of some loyalty.
David was like a brother, you know, and I would do anything for him.
David Anderson was then questioned. He claimed he was playing video games with Alex that night and hadn't been involved in the murders.
That's all I'll tell you.
David Anderson said very little. David was told that Alex had confessed and made no difference to him.
He seemed to me to be very relaxed, somewhat nonchalant about everything, and this is a murder investigation, which I thought was odd.
Investigators then asked him about his friend, Kim Wilson.
He said, I'm sad about it, but that's really all the information he would give. He played it very, very cool with me.
Without any evidence linking him to the murders, David Anderson couldn't be charged.
We had to release him. I believe he thought he had outsmarted us.
Listen, I don't have anything on me.
Investigators searched Alex's home for further evidence.
The evidence we found in Alex Brawny's room was a VCR that was taken from the Wilsons' house. It had blood on it.
They also found a CD player and a telephone stolen from the Wilsons. But they didn't find any boots which matched the bloody footprints at the crime scene, nor any murder weapons.
Everything that had blood on it was disposed of, very far away. There were a pair of bootlaces covered in blood found in my garbage can. No idea where those came from. They weren't mine.
Investigators probed further into the suspect's open conversations about murder.
We learned that both of them knew and had discussed the fact that if they committed murder after they turned 18, they might be subject to the death penalty. So there was an element of calculation here.
The juvenile court system would not have such a severe penalty against the juvenile committing murder.
Detectives discovered that on the night of the murders, David had borrowed his girlfriend's truck.
A witness came forward and told us he had observed a pickup truck parked in the parking lot of Water Tower Park at the time of the murder.
There was incriminating evidence inside the vehicle, including a T-shirt, which was similar to one found at the murder scene.
We found rope in that pickup truck that matched the rope around Kim Wilson's neck. This gave us probable cause to bring David in and arrest him.
On January the 14th, 1997, David Anderson was arrested on suspicion of murder. The case against him was mounting. There was now sufficient evidence for a search warrant. Boots and clothing from his home were sent for detailed forensic examination. David Anderson's diary also helped to seal his fate.
The primary target of his anger was Kim Wilson. I think Anderson thought that Kim basically ought to consider it a privilege to be able to associate with him at all.
His motivation for wanting to kill her appeared to be a simple grudge.
He was outraged when she sort of began to express a certain independence and began to suggest that perhaps he ought to pay for his own cigarettes rather than borrowing hers.
It was her demands on him and his perceived loss of control that outraged him.
This seemingly sort of trivial motive seemed to really inflame Anderson in some way that I can't completely fathom.
David always thought he was smarter than everyone else.
He knew that he wanted to kill Kimberly Wilson, and he was going to do it with the help of Alex Barani.
Despite the case against Anderson and Barani, forensic evidence would be vital to secure their convictions. In Bellevue, Washington State, suspected multiple murderers David Anderson and Alex Barani were in police custody. It took 9 months to analyze the extensive forensic evidence. A cigarette discovered close to Kim Wilson's body contained her DNA. It was likely she knew her killer.
It was quite clear that Kim had voluntarily rendezvoused with someone that she knew and had smoked a cigarette with him. Kim Wilson did not like Alex Barani and made no secret of that.
I'd only met her a couple times. I barely knew her name, really.
Investigators believe David had picked Kim up that night and took her to the park where Alex was waiting.
Stop acting like my parent. Yeah.
You think this is funny? I'm on the right track, all right?
Microscopic evidence linked the two friends with the murders. The blood on the shoelaces found in Alex's bedroom was confirmed as William Wilson's.
There was blood found on the pair of boots that David wore on the night of the murder.
The blood was a match with William and Julia Wilson.
I knew David Anderson participated in the murders. Now we had physical evidence to prove he was involved in the murders.
He'd apparently cleaned his boots fairly carefully, but he had missed some very small airborne droplets of blood from 2 of the 3 victims of the murders in the house. These bloodstains are associated with what they call medium velocity blood spatter, which is associated with blunt force, like striking someone with a baseball bat.
Police were now convinced the Wilson family were murdered because they knew Kim was with David.
The problem with the plan, per se, is that you have to make sure there are no witnesses to who the girl is going out with.
All of the murders were premeditated.
In their conversations among their friends, they had noted that if you killed one person, you had to kill everybody in the house because they would be potential witnesses.
The intense bond between David and Alex was integral to the investigation.
David controlled the relationship with Alex. David was more confident, more grandiose, generally in control, and Alex a follower. I think their rage together became synergistic.
I believe Alex and David were kind of a lock and a key. They could have walked away at so many different points, but didn't.
I would rather keep the promises to my friends and kill someone than break the promises that I've made to my friends.
David's lawyer requested separate trials for the teenagers.
They thought that they would be treated in the juvenile system if they committed these murders before they were 18. They were wrong about that.
Both David and Alex were tried as adults. On October the 12th, 1998, Alex Barani pleaded not guilty to 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He claimed diminished mental capacity.
The gist of his mental defense was that he was really not responsible because he was under the influence of this other sort of charismatic, evil person, David Anderson.
Wasn't my idea. I was certainly not taking the lead. I was being manipulated into doing what I did.
There, frankly, was very little, if any, evidence that he suffered from any kind of mental illness or infirmity at all.
There really wasn't much of a case, though, honestly. The mental defense that we used was basically a complete last resort.
We as a jury find the defendant guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree as charged.
On November the 4th, 1998, Alex Barani was found guilty of 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder.
He knew exactly what was going to happen. And he did not take that opportunity to say anything or express any.
Waiting to die.
He will spend the rest of his life in prison.
Once I got to prison, that gave me free time to start really thinking about what I had done. My God, what did I do? Why did I do that? And how could I do this to these people? I want them to know that I really do feel terrible about what I did. And I would do anything to make it up, to fix it. I know I can't. And I'm sorry for that. I feel privileged that I'm still alive. Basically, I was given a chance that I did not give my victims. And I'm not sure if that's justice, but I'm thankful for it.
On January the 25th, 1999, David Anderson stood trial for the murders of the Wilson family. He also pleaded not guilty, claiming Alex had acted alone. When Alex refused to testify against his friend, the prosecution relied on forensic and circumstantial evidence. Without a confession and no eyewitnesses, the 8th-month trial ended in deadlock.
It's always really disappointing to have a mistrial. It leaves everything completely unresolved.
On October the 11th, 1999, a second trial began. This time, David Anderson's defense stated there had been 2 killers that night, but claimed David had not been one of them.
Witnesses tell us he had collected knives and swords to do this with. He planned almost every aspect of this, obviously, because he wanted to get away with it.
After a trial lasting 2 months, David Anderson was found guilty of all charges. He received life without parole. He still maintains his innocence.
You know, it's very mixed feelings about getting a verdict of guilty in a case like this, because although it's a relief to everyone, this really was 4 counts of aggravated murder committed by 2 17-year-old boys.
Former friends of the killers remain shocked by the murders.
You know, I can't believe that I was friends with, with 2 guys that could murder an entire family. More so, I can't believe that I ever, brought them to my home or introduced them to my parents or my brothers and sisters, and, it blows me away.
David Anderson and Alex Barani will never meet again.
I found out that he really didn't understand me as much as I thought. And, that friendship is gone. It's over now.
This case, out of all the homicides I've investigated, did affect me. I have a family very much like the Wilson family. A wife, 2 daughters, same ages. It could happen to anyone, at any time.
So I know from the duration of sitting through that trial, I locked every door at night, and I made sure every window was shut, because you had the sense that monsters were out there, and that monsters could break into your house. David and Alex that night were monsters.